My name's Walter Hayes. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 42 years working in a steel mill outside Pittsburgh. I wasn't a rich man, but I never missed a mortgage payment, never asked anyone for a handout, and never broke a promise. My wife, Margaret, used to say, "As long as we have each other, we're doing just fine." Back then, I believed her. After Margaret passed away, Christmas became the one day that still felt like home. My daughter Emily never let me spend it alone. Every year she'd come over with her famous pecan pie, complain that I bought the wrong wrapping paper, and laugh when I overcooked the turkey. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. That's why I answered her phone call with a smile 3 days before Christmas. "Hey, kiddo. You all set for Wednesday?" There was a long pause. Not the kind where someone gets distracted. The kind where they're trying to figure out how to hurt you without sounding cruel. Finally she spoke. "Dad, Ryan and I have been talking." The second she said Ryan's name first, something didn't feel right. "About what?" I asked. Another pause. "We think it'd be better if you didn't come over this year." I actually laughed. I thought she was kidding. Then I realized she wasn't laughing. "I'm serious," she said quietly. "We just want a quiet Christmas." A quiet Christmas. I looked across the room at the tree I'd spent 2 hours decorating the night before. There were gifts underneath it. One for Emily. One for Ryan. I never cared much for the guy, but he was family, or at least I thought he was. "So let me get this straight," I said. "You're asking your own father to stay home on Christmas? It's only this year. Why?" I don't want to argue. That answer bothered me more than anything else she'd said. Argue about what? We hadn't had a single fight. Not one. I lowered my voice. "Emily, is this really coming from you?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, it sounded rehearsed. "Yeah, I think it's for the best." We hung up. I didn't slam the phone down. I didn't yell. Truth is, I just sat there at my kitchen table staring out the window. A light snow had started falling across the backyard. Everything looked peaceful. Funny how life can fall apart on the quietest day. I sat there for exactly 4 minutes. Not because I didn't know what to do. Because I was remembering something Ryan had completely forgotten. 15 years earlier, after Margaret got sick, our attorney made me sign a document that almost nobody knew existed. I hadn't looked at it in years. I walked into my office, unlocked an old fireproof cabinet, and pulled out a worn yellow envelope. The moment I saw my own signature on the front, I knew Ryan wasn't trying to keep Christmas peaceful. He was trying to keep me away from something. And before Christmas was over, he was going to find out just how badly he'd underestimated an old steelworker. I didn't open that envelope right away. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and just sat there staring at it. Funny thing about getting older, your mind starts replaying moments you ignored when they first happened. The more I thought about Ryan, the more I realized this whole mess hadn't started with that phone call. It started the day he married my daughter. When Emily first introduced us, I wanted to like him. He was polite, well-dressed, and always talking about business. Real estate. Investments. Building wealth. I figured he was just an ambitious young guy trying to make something of himself. I respected that. But after the wedding, I noticed a pattern. Ryan never asked how I was doing. Never asked about retirement. Never even mentioned Margaret. Every conversation somehow ended up in the same place. My land. "Walter," he'd say, "that lot on Independence Boulevard has to be worth a fortune by now." I'd shrug. "Maybe. You ever think about selling it?" "No." A few months later, he'd ask again. Different words. Same question. "You could cash out and move somewhere warmer." "I already live where I want to live." He'd laugh like I was kidding. I wasn't. That land wasn't just another piece of property. My father and I bought it back in the 80s, after years of overtime shifts. Every paycheck, every sacrifice, every blister on my hands helped pay for it. After he passed, I promised myself I'd never let anyone pressure me into selling it. Ryan never understood that. To him, it was just money. Then Emily started changing. She stopped calling every Sunday. Dinner invitations became excuses. And whenever we talked, she'd casually ask about my will, retirement plans, or what I'd eventually do with the property. I kept telling myself she was only worried about me. Now I know she was asking someone else's questions. About 6 months before Christmas, I stopped by their place with tomatoes from my garden. As I walked toward the porch, I heard Ryan talking inside. "I'm telling you," he said. "Once he signs, we're set." I couldn't hear Emily's reply. Then Ryan laughed. "I don't care how sentimental he is. Everybody has a price." I knocked. The conversation stopped instantly. Ryan opened the door wearing that same polished smile. "Walter, what a surprise!" I smiled back. "Looks like it." I stayed for a few minutes, handed Emily the tomatoes, and drove home. At the time, I convinced myself I was reading too much into it. Looking back, I wasn't. I just didn't realize I was already part of a plan that had been unfolding for months. And sitting on my kitchen table was the one document Ryan never knew existed. I carried that yellow envelope back to the kitchen and laid it on the table like it was made of glass. The paper felt old, the edges worn from years of sitting untouched in that cabinet. I hadn't looked at it since Margaret was still alive. Back then, her cancer had gotten worse, and our attorney insisted we get everything in order. I remember telling him we didn't have much worth arguing over. He smiled and said, "Walter, families don't fight over what things are worth. They fight over what they think they're entitled to." At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Turns out, he was trying to warn me. I opened the envelope and spread the papers across the table. The first few pages were exactly what I remembered. Property records, tax documents, a copy of the original deed my father and I had signed back in 1984. Then I found the document I was looking for. A signed transfer restriction. It was simple but powerful. If anyone ever tried to pressure, deceive, or manipulate me into selling the property, the sale could be legally challenged under the conditions we had written into the family trust. The land couldn't be transferred without my direct approval in front of our attorney and 2 independent witnesses. Ryan didn't know that. He couldn't know. The trust had never been recorded publicly because there'd never been a reason to use it. Until now. I leaned back in my chair and thought about every conversation we'd ever had. Every question about the property. Every fake smile. Every suggestion that I should finally enjoy retirement. None of it had been casual. He'd been testing me, seeing how close I was to giving in. Then something else hit me. If Ryan wanted me out of the house on Christmas, maybe he wasn't planning to convince me anymore. Maybe he already believed he had another way. That thought sent a chill down my spine. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found one name I hadn't called in almost 3 years. David Mercer, ***, my attorney. It was almost 6 in the evening, so I figured I'd leave a voicemail. Instead, he answered on the second ring. "Walter? Everything all right?" "I hope so," I said. "Tell me, if someone tried to move forward with paperwork involving my property without me knowing, would I be notified?" There was a brief silence. Then his voice changed. "Why are you asking me that?" I looked back at the document spread across my table. "Because I think someone believes I'm easier to fool than I really am." David didn't laugh. "Don't sign anything," he said. "And don't tell anyone we talked. Come by my office first thing tomorrow morning." When the call ended, I looked out the window again. The snow was falling harder now. For the first time in years, Christmas didn't feel warm. It felt like a deadline. And deep down, I had a feeling Ryan's real plan was already in motion. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing Emily's voice. "We think it'd be better if you skipped Christmas." Not I think. We think, The more I replayed the conversation, the more I realized Ryan had been speaking through her for a long time. The next morning, I drove downtown to David Mercer's office. We'd known each other for over 20 years. He wasn't just my attorney. He'd helped Margaret and me through some of the hardest days of our lives. When I walked in, he looked at my face and frowned. "You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't." He closed his office door before either of us sat down. "Tell me everything." So I did. The phone call. The property questions. The conversation I'd overheard outside Emily's house. Everything. David listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "Walter, I need to ask you something." "Shoot. Has anyone recently asked you to sign paperwork?" "Anything at all. Tax forms, refinancing, estate planning, even something that looked routine." I thought about it for a second. Then I remembered. About 3 weeks earlier, Ryan had stopped by my house with a folder. He claimed his accountant was organizing family financial records and asked if I'd sign a document confirming the property's address for insurance purposes. Something about it felt rushed. I told him I'd read it later. He smiled and said, "No rush." The folder disappeared when he left. At the time, I didn't think much of it. David's expression changed. "Do you still have a copy?" I shook my head. "I never signed it." "That's good," he said quietly, "because that's probably not what he wanted." He turned his computer screen toward me and pulled up public county records. "There hasn't been a transfer." I let out a breath. "But," he continued, "someone requested a property information packet from the county 2 weeks ago." I stared at him. "Who?" "They won't tell us without a formal request." The room suddenly felt smaller. Ryan wasn't guessing anymore. He was preparing. David closed the file and looked me straight in the eye. "From this moment on, don't meet Ryan alone. Don't sign a single piece of paper. And if he asks about that land again," he paused, "let him think you still trust him." I nodded slowly. For the first time, I understood what was happening. This wasn't a family disagreement. It was a setup. And whoever was pulling the string still believed I hadn't noticed. I intended to keep it that way. Because sometimes, the safest place to hide the truth is behind the smile everyone expects to see. I drove home from David's office with one decision already made. I wasn't going to confront Ryan. Not yet. If he believed I had no idea what he was doing, that was my advantage. People get careless when they think they've already won. That afternoon, my phone rang. "Ryan." I let it ring twice before answering. "Hey, Walter," he said, sounding friendlier than usual. "Just checking in. You doing okay?" I almost laughed. 3 days ago, I wasn't welcome at Christmas. Now he suddenly cared how I was feeling. "I'm doing fine," I said. "Good. Emily's been feeling bad about everything. She hopes you understand." "I do." There was a short pause. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "So, have you thought any more about that property?" There it was again. Always the property. Never family. Never Christmas. Just the land. "No," I answered. "I guess I'm more sentimental than you are." He chuckled. "You can't take land with you, Walter." "No," I said calmly. "But I can decide who never gets it." For a second, the line went completely quiet. Then his cheerful voice came back. "Well, if you ever change your mind, I know some serious buyers." "I'm sure you do." We ended the call a minute later. The second I hung up, I grabbed a notebook and wrote everything down. The time. His exact words. Even the long pauses. David had told me to keep records, so that's exactly what I was going to do. Over the next 2 days, Ryan called twice more. Emily texted me 3 times. Not once did either of them ask how I was doing. Not once did they mention opening presents or having dinner together. Every conversation somehow circled back to my retirement, my future, and that piece of land. By Friday afternoon, David called again. "I found something," he said. "What is it?" "The county confirmed someone recently requested detailed parcel records for your property." I gripped the phone tighter. "Can you tell who?" No. But they also asked about ownership transfer requirements. That wasn't normal. Nobody asks questions like that unless they're planning something. After we hung up, I walked into my garage and pulled an old metal box off a shelf. Inside were decades of papers, receipts, old photographs, letters Margaret had written while I worked night shifts. At the very bottom sat a small leather notebook that had belonged to my father. I opened it. The first sentence caught my eye immediately. Never let anyone rush you into signing a paper they don't want you to read twice. Asterisk. I smiled. Dad had been gone for nearly 20 years. Somehow, he was still looking out for me. And at that moment, I made up my mind. I wasn't staying home on Christmas. I was going to show up. Just not the way Ryan expected. Christmas morning arrived colder than usual. The weather forecast called for snow all day, but I barely noticed. I was standing in my kitchen making coffee, looking at the Christmas card Margaret had given me the year before she died. On the front she'd written, asterisk, no matter what happens, don't ever let fear make your decisions. Asterisk. I slipped the card back into the drawer and smiled. All right, Maggie, I said quietly. Let's see where this goes. Around 10 that morning, Emily texted me. Hope you're doing okay. Merry Christmas. Asterisk asterisk. That was it. No invitation. No. Come by if you change your mind. Just 8 words that felt colder than the snow outside. I replied with 2 words. Merry Christmas. Asterisk asterisk. Nothing more. About an hour later, David called. You still planning to go? I am. Good. But remember, you're not going there to argue. I know. If Ryan brings up the property, let him talk. The more comfortable he feels, the more likely he'll make a mistake. That was exactly what I intended to do. I waited until early afternoon before leaving the house. Instead of carrying wrapped presents like I usually did, I carried one small leather folder. Inside was the trust agreement, the original deed, and every note I'd written over the past few days. As I pulled into Emily's neighborhood, I noticed something strange. 3 expensive SUVs were parked in the driveway. I didn't recognize any of them. Ryan had told Emily they wanted a quiet Christmas. It didn't look very quiet to me. I stayed in the truck for another minute, watching people move around inside the house. Men in dress coats. A woman carrying what looked like a portfolio. Nobody looked like family. Nobody looked like they were there for Christmas dinner. My stomach tightened. David had been right. This wasn't a holiday gathering. It looked like a business meeting. I stepped out of the truck, straightened my old winter coat, and walked toward the front door. Before I knocked, I could hear Ryan laughing inside. Then someone said, So when does the owner get here? Ryan answered without hesitation. He won't. Everyone laughed. I stood there for a second, staring at the front door. He wasn't just trying to keep me away. He had already told people I wasn't coming. I smiled to myself. For the first time all week, I finally understood the whole plan. I reached for the doorknob. Because in about 10 seconds, Ryan was going to realize the one person he never expected to see had just walked into his Christmas surprise. I knocked once. The room went quiet almost instantly. A few seconds later, the front door opened, and there stood Ryan. The smile on his face lasted about half a second. After that, it vanished. Walter. He looked genuinely shocked. I thought you were coming. I wasn't invited, I said with a small smile. There's a difference. Before he could answer, I stepped inside. The living room didn't look anything like Christmas. The tree was lit, sure, but nobody was paying attention to it. For people in business suits were gathered around the dining table with folders, laptops, and coffee cups. One man stood up as I walked in. I'm sorry, he said politely. You are? Before Ryan could speak, I answered. I'm Walter Hayes. The man blinked. The owner? Last time I checked. Nobody said a word. Emily walked out of the kitchen, and the second she saw me, all the color drained from her face. Dad! You seem surprised. I I thought you decided to stay home. I changed my mind. Ryan forced another smile. We were just having a casual meeting with a few friends. I looked around the room. Friends usually don't bring contracts to Christmas dinner. One of the men slowly closed the folder in front of him. Nobody laughed. The room suddenly felt very small. I turned back to Ryan. So what exactly was everyone discussing? He cleared his throat. Nothing important. Really? I looked at the papers on the table. Then you won't mind if I take a look. Ryan stepped forward. They're private. I smiled. My property isn't. That hit him harder than I expected. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked nervous. One of the investors finally spoke. Ryan told us you weren't interested in keeping the land. I looked directly at him. That's interesting. Because I never told Ryan that. The man slowly turned toward Ryan. So, you don't have an agreement? Ryan didn't answer. He couldn't. Emily stood frozen by the kitchen island, staring at the floor. The confidence Ryan had been wearing all week was disappearing right in front of everyone. I reached into my leather folder and placed the yellow envelope on the dining table. I figured since everyone's here, I should probably show you the paperwork Ryan forgot to mention. Every eye in the room shifted toward the envelope. Ryan whispered only one word. What? And that's when I realized. The game had finally begun. Nobody reached for the envelope. They just stared at it. Ryan looked like he wanted to grab it, but he knew he couldn't. Not with 4 investors watching his every move. I slid the papers out one by one and laid them across the dining table. I haven't looked at these in years, I said. Never thought I'd need to. One of the investors adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. What exactly are we looking at? My family trust. The room stayed silent. Ryan folded his arms and tried to sound confident. That doesn't change anything. I looked at him. You sure about that? I handed the first page to the man standing nearest me. He read it quietly for a few seconds. Then his eyebrows lifted. This says the property can't be transferred without Mr. Hayes appearing in person before his attorney and 2 independent witnesses. That's right, I said. The investor looked at Ryan. You told us everything was already lined up. Ryan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I continued before he could recover. You also left out the part where any attempt to obtain the property through deception can legally void the entire transaction. Another investor reached for the next page. You never mentioned that either, he said, looking straight at Ryan. Emily finally spoke. Ryan, what's he talking about? Ryan rubbed the back of his neck. It's just legal language. It doesn't mean. It means exactly what it says, I interrupted. I had this trust written after my wife got sick. My attorney wanted to make sure nobody could pressure me into signing something I didn't fully understand. One by one, the investors closed their folders. The atmosphere in the room changed completely. A few minutes earlier, they'd walked in expecting a business deal. Now they were realizing they might have been invited into a legal mess. The oldest investor stood up first. Ryan. His voice was calm, but there wasn't much patience left in it. Did you tell us the owner had no idea this meeting was happening? Ryan didn't answer. The silence was answer enough. The man slowly packed his documents into his briefcase. I don't do business like this. Another investor followed. So do I. Within 30 seconds, every folder on that table was closed. The deal Ryan had spent months trying to build was falling apart without anyone raising their voice. As the last investor walked toward the front door, he stopped beside me. Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry this happened in your home. I nodded. So am I. The front door closed behind them. For the first time all afternoon, it was just me, Emily, and Ryan. Ryan stared at the empty driveway through the front window. Then he turned around. The smile he'd always hidden behind was finally gone. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The house felt strangely quiet. The Christmas music was still playing in the background, but now it sounded completely out of place. Ryan looked at Emily. Say something, She didn't. Instead, she looked at me. Dad! Her voice cracked. Is everything he said true? I nodded. Every word. She slowly turned back toward Ryan. You told me Dad was already planning to sell. Ryan didn't answer. You said he just wanted a better price. Still nothing. Emily took another step toward him. You told me those people were coming over to discuss future development after Dad agreed. Ryan let out a long breath. I was trying to speed things up. She stared at him. So you lied? It wasn't like that. No. She pointed at the empty dining table. You invited investors into our house on Christmas Day before my father even knew they were coming. Ryan ran a hand through his hair. I was thinking about our future. Our future? Emily's voice grew louder. Or yours? I stayed where I was. There was nothing left for me to say. Sometimes the truth does all the talking. Emily walked over to the Christmas tree and picked up one of the wrapped presents. It had my handwriting on it. She looked at the tag for a long moment before her eyes filled with tears. You still bought us gifts. Of course I did, I said quietly. You're my daughter. She covered her mouth. I told you not to come. I know. And you still came. I came because Christmas isn't about being invited. It's about family. Ryan looked at me. Walter, maybe we can sit down and work something out. I met his eyes. For 2 years, you didn't want a conversation. You wanted my signature. He took one step toward me. I made a mistake. No, I replied calmly. A mistake happens once. This was a plan. The room fell silent again. Emily slowly walked over and stood beside me. Not behind Ryan. Beside me. For the first time since she'd made that phone call, I felt like my daughter was finally seeing things clearly. She looked at Ryan with tears running down her face. I need you to tell me the truth. Did you ever love me? Or were you just trying to get to my father's land? Ryan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And sometimes, silence tells you everything you need to know. Ryan looked from Emily to me, but neither of us said a word. Finally, he lowered his head. It started with the property, he admitted quietly. At first, I thought if we sold it, we'd never have to worry about money again. Emily stared at him. So that's why you married me? Ryan hesitated. I loved you, but I also knew what your father owned. The words hit her harder than any shout ever could. She stepped back like she didn't even recognize the man standing in front of her. For years, she defended him, trusted him, chosen him over me. And now the truth was standing right there in the middle of the living room. She took off her wedding ring and placed it on the dining table. I can't do this anymore. Ryan's face turned pale. Emily, please. She shook her head. You didn't just lie to my dad. You lied to me. The room went completely still. I picked up the yellow envelope and slipped it back into my leather folder. I didn't come here to humiliate you, Ryan. I came because that land isn't just worth money. It's the last piece of my father, and the last promise I ever made to him. He looked down at the floor. I understand. No, I said calmly. You understand that you got caught. That's different. He didn't argue. There wasn't anything left to say. I walked over to the Christmas tree and picked up the 2 presents I'd brought. One was for Emily. The other had Ryan's name on it. I looked at it for a second, then quietly placed it back under the tree. Merry Christmas, I said. Emily's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry, Dad. I gave her a hug. I know. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the first step. As I walked toward the front door, the snow had started falling again. Everything outside was white, fresh, quiet, almost like the world was giving us another chance. A week later, Emily moved out of the house and filed for divorce. Ryan's business partners walked away, and the deal he spent months chasing disappeared before the new year. As for me, I still own that piece of land. I still spend Sunday afternoons there, just like my father did. Sometimes I sit on the old wooden fence and think about everything that happened. People ask me if I regret showing up that Christmas. Not for a second. Because I learned something that day. The strongest revenge isn't destroying someone's life. It's refusing to let them steal yours. And every Christmas since then, when I look across that land, I don't see dollars. I see family. And that's something no contract will ever be worth. People think stories like this in the moment the bad guy loses. They don't. Real life keeps moving. 6 months after that Christmas, I was back on my land one Saturday morning, fixing an old fence that honestly didn't need fixing. Sometimes I just liked having an excuse to be there. The phone in my pocket rang. It was Emily. By then, we'd started talking again. Not every day. Not even every week. Trust doesn't grow back overnight. Hey, Dad. Morning, kiddo. I was wondering. Are you busy? I looked around at the empty field and smiled. Depends who's asking. She laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd heard from her in months. I made lunch. You did? And? I didn't burn the rolls this time. I couldn't help smiling. Well, now I know you're lying. She laughed even harder. For the first time in a long while. It sounded like my daughter again. When I got to her apartment, there wasn't much furniture inside. Divorce isn't just emotionally expensive. It's financially expensive too. She apologized before we even sat down. Dad, I know saying I'm sorry isn't enough. No, I said. It isn't. She looked down at the table. But it's a start. She nodded. I should have trusted you. I reached across the table and held her hand. You know what your mom used to tell you when you were little? Emily smiled through her tears. Everybody deserves one chance to make things right. That's right. We ate lunch. Talked about normal things. Work. Neighbors. Baseball. For the first time in years. Nobody mentioned the property. Nobody mentioned money. On my way home, I stopped by the old piece of land. The sun was setting behind the trees, just like it had hundreds of times before. Nothing about the land had changed. The only thing that had changed was me. I realized I hadn't won because Ryan lost. I won because I refused to become bitter. That Christmas taught me something I'll never forget. The people who truly love you will never make you prove your worth. And the things worth protecting usually aren't the things money can buy. If you've made it this far, let me leave you with this. Never let someone rush your decisions. Never sign something you don't fully understand. And never mistake kindness for weakness. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who is already 3 steps ahead.